Chapter 2 of the Humbugs of the World. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Eddie Winter. The Humbugs of the World by P.T. Barnum. Definition of the word humbug. Warren of London. Genin the Hatter. Gosling's Blacking. Chapter 2. Upon a careful consideration of my undertaking to give an account of the humbugs of the world, I find myself somewhat puzzled in regard to the true definition of that word. To be sure, Webster says that humbug, as a noun, is an imposition under fair pretences, and as a verb it is to deceive, to impose upon. With all due deference to Dr. Webster, I submit that, according to present usage, this is not the only, nor even the generally accepted definition of that term. We will suppose, for instance, that a man with fair pretences applies to a wholesale merchant for credit on a large bill of goods. His fair pretences comprehend an assertion that he is a moral and religious man, a member of the church, a man of wealth, etc., etc. It turns out that he is not worth $1, but is a base, lying wretch, an impostor and a cheat. He is arrested and imprisoned for obtaining property under false pretences, or, as Webster says, fair pretences. He is punished for his villainy. The public do not call him a humbug. They very properly term him a swindler. A man bearing the appearance of a gentleman in dress and manners purchases property from you, and with fair pretences obtains your confidence. You find that when he has left, that he paid you with counterfeit banknotes or a forged draft. This man is justly called a forger or a counterfeiter, and if arrested he is punished as such, but nobody thinks of calling him a humbug. A respectable looking man sits by your side in an omnibus or rail car. He converses fluently and is evidently a man of intelligence and reading. He attracts your attention by his fair pretences. Arriving at your journey's end, you miss your watch and your pocket book. Your fellow passenger proves to be the thief. Everybody calls him a pickpocket, and notwithstanding his fair pretences, not a person in the community calls him a humbug. Two actors appear as stars at two rival theatres. They are equally talented, equally pleasing. One advertises himself simply as a tragedian, under his proper name. The other boasts that he is a prince, and wears decorations presented by all the potentates of the world, including the King of the Cannibal Islands. He is correctly set down as a humbug, while this term is never applied to the other actor. But if the man who boasts of having received a foreign title is a miserable actor, and he gets up gift enterprises and bogus entertainments, or pretends to devote the proceeds of his tragic efforts to some charitable object, without in fact doing so, he is then a humbug in Dr. Webster's sense of that word, for he is an impostor under fair pretences. Two physicians reside in one of our fashionable avenues. They are both educated in the best medical colleges. Each has passed an examination, received his diploma, and been dubbed an M.D. They are equally skilled in the healing art. One rides quietly about the city in his gig or brougham, visiting his patients without noise or clamour. The other sallies out in his coach and four, preceded by a band of music, and his carriage and horses are covered with handbills and placards announcing his wonderful cures. This man is properly called a quack and a humbug. Why? Not because he cheats or imposes upon the public, for he does not, but because, as generally understood, humbug consists in putting on glittering appearances, outside show, novel expedients, by which to suddenly arrest public attention and attract the public eye and ear. Clergymen, lawyers, or physicians who should resort to such methods of attracting the public would not, for obvious reasons, be apt to succeed. Bankers, insurance agents, and others who aspired to become the custodians of the money of their fellow men would require a different species of advertising from this. But there are various trades and occupations which need only notoriety to ensure success, always providing that when customers are once attracted, they never fail to get their money's worth. An honest man who thus arrests public attention will be called a humbug, but he is not a swindler or an impostor. If, however, after attracting crowds of customers by his unique displays, a man foolishly fails to give them a full equivalent for their money, they never patronize him a second time, but they very properly denounce him as a swindler, a cheat, an impostor. They do not, however, call him a humbug. He fails not because he advertises his wares in an outre manner, but because after attracting crowds of patrons he stupidly and wickedly cheats them. When the great blacking maker of London dispatched his agent to Egypt to write on the pyramids of Giza in huge letters, "By Warren's Blacking, 30 Strand, London," he was not cheating travellers upon the Nile. His blacking was really a superior article, and well worth the price charged for it, but he was humbugging the public by his queer way of arresting attention. It turned out just as he anticipated, that English travellers in that part of Egypt were indignant at this desecration, and they wrote back to the London Times. Every Englishman writes or threatens to write to the Times if anything goes wrong, denouncing the Goth who had thus disfigured these ancient pyramids by writing on them in monstrous letters, "By Warren's Blacking, 30 Strand, London." The Times published these letters, and backed them up by several of those awful, grand, and dictatorial editorials peculiar to the great thunderer, in which the blacking maker, Warren, 30 Strand, was stigmatized as a man who had no respect for the ancient patriarchs, and it was hinted that he would probably not hesitate to sell his blacking on the sarcophagus of Pharaoh, or any other mummy, if he could only make money by it. In fact, to cap the climax, Warren was denounced as a humbug. These indignant articles were copied into all the provincial journals, and very soon, in this manner, the columns of every newspaper in Great Britain were teeming with this advice: "Try Warren's Blacking, 30 Strand, London." The curiosity of the public was thus aroused, and they did try it, and finding a superior article, they continued to purchase it and recommend it to their friends, and Warren made a fortune by it. He always attributed his success to his having humbugged the public by this unique method of advertising his blacking in Egypt. But Warren did not cheat his customers, nor practise an imposition under fair pretences. He was a humbug, but he was an honest, upright man, and no one called him an impostor or a cheat. When the tickets for Jenny Lind's first concert in America were sold at auction, several business men aspiring to notoriety bid high for the first ticket. It was finally knocked down to Genin the Hatter for $225. The journals in Portland, Maine, and Houston, Texas, and all other journals throughout the United States between these two cities, which were connected with the telegraph, announced the fact in their columns the next morning. Probably 2 million of readers read the announcement and asked, "Who is Genin the Hatter?" Genin became famous in a day. Every man involuntarily examined his hat to see if it was made by Genin, and an Iowa editor declared that one of his neighbors discovered the name of Genin in his old hat, and immediately announced the fact to his neighbors in front of the post office. It was suggested that the old hat should be sold at auction. It was done then and there, and the Genin hat sold for $14. Gentlemen from city and country rushed to Genin's store to buy their hats, many of them willing to pay an extra $1, if necessary, provided they could get a glimpse of Genin himself. This singular freak put thousands of dollars into the pocket of Genin the Hatter, and yet I never heard it charged that he made poor hats, or that he would be guilty of an imposition under fair pretences. On the contrary, he is a gentleman of probity, and of the first respectability. When the laying of the Atlantic Telegraph was nearly completed, I was in Liverpool. I offered the company £1,000 sterling ($5,000) for the privilege of sending the first 20 words over the cable to my museum in New York. Not that there was any intrinsic merit in the words, but that I fancied there were more than $5,000 worth of notoriety in the operation. But Queen Victoria and Old Buck were ahead of me. Their messages had the preference, and I was compelled to take a back seat. By thus illustrating what I believe the public will concede to be the sense in which the word humbug is generally used and understood at the present time in this country as well as in England, I do not propose that my letters on this subject shall be narrowed down to that definition of the word. On the contrary, I expect to treat of various fallacies, delusions, and deceptions in ancient and modern times, which, according to Webster's definition, may be called humbugs, inasmuch as they were impositions under fair pretences. In writing of modern humbugs, however, I shall sometimes have occasion to give the names of honest and respectable parties now living, and I felt it but just that the public should fully comprehend my doctrine, that a man may, by common usage, be termed a humbug without by any means impeaching his integrity. Speaking of blacking makers reminds me that one of the first sensationists in advertising whom I remember to have seen was Mr. Leonard Gosling, known as Monsieur Gosling, the great French blacking maker. He appeared in New York in 1830. He flashed like a meteor across the horizon, and before he had been in the city 3 months, nearly everybody had heard of Gosling's blacking. I well remember his magnificent 4-in-hand. A splendid team of blood bays, with long black tails, was managed with such dexterity by Gosling himself, who was a great whip, that they almost seemed to fly. The carriage was emblazoned with the words "Gosling's blacking" in large gold letters, and the whole turnout was so elaborately ornamented and bedizened that everybody stopped and gazed with wondering admiration. A bugle player or a band of music always accompanied the great Gosling, and of course helped to attract the public attention to his establishment. At the turning of every street corner your eyes rested upon Gosling's blacking. From every show window gilded placards discoursed eloquently of the merits of Gosling's blacking. The newspapers teemed with poems written in its praise, and showers of pictorial handbills, illustrated almanacs, and tinselled souvenirs, all lauding the virtues of Gosling's blacking, smothered you at every point. The celebrated originator of delineations, Jim Crow Rice, made his first appearance at Hamblin's Bowery Theatre at about this time. The crowds which thronged there were so great that hundreds from the audience were frequently admitted upon the stage. In one of his scenes Rice introduced a negro boot-blacking establishment. Gosling was too wide awake to let such an opportunity pass unimproved, and Rice was paid for singing an original black Gosling ditty, while a score of placards bearing the inscription "Use Gosling's blacking" were suspended at different points in this negro boot polishing hall. Everybody cried "Gosling's blacking," and it was a really good article. His sales in city and country soon became immense. Gosling made a fortune in 7 years, and retired, but, as with thousands before him, it was easy come, easy go. He engaged in a lead mining speculation, and it was generally understood that his fortune was, in a great measure, lost as rapidly as it was made. Here let me digress, in order to observe that one of the most difficult things in life is for men to bear discreetly sudden prosperity. Unless considerable time and labour are devoted to earning money, it is not appreciated by its possessor, and having no practical knowledge of the value of money, he generally gets rid of it with the same ease that marked its accumulation. Mr. Astor gave the experience of thousands when he said that he found more difficulty in earning and saving his first $1,000 than in accumulating all the subsequent millions which finally made up his fortune. The very economy, perseverance, and discipline which he was obliged to practise as he gained his money dollar by dollar, gave him a just appreciation of its value, and thus led him into those habits of industry, prudence, temperance, and untiring diligence, so conducive and necessary to his future success. Mr. Gosling, however, was not a man to be put down by a single financial reverse. He opened a store in Kaneohari, New York, which was burned, and on which there was no insurance. He came again to New York in 1839, and established a restaurant where, by devoting the services of himself and several members of his family assiduously to the business, he soon revelled in his former prosperity, and snapped his fingers in glee at what unreflecting persons termed the freaks of Dame Fortune. He is still living in New York, hale and hearty at the age of 70. Although called a French blacking maker, Mr. Gosling is, in reality, a Dutchman, having been born in the city of Amsterdam, Holland. He is a father of 24 children, 12 of whom are still living to cheer him in his declining years, and to repay him in grateful attentions for the valuable lessons of prudence, integrity, and industry, through the adoption of which they are honoured as respectable and worthy members of society. I cannot, however, permit this chapter to close without recording a protest in principle against that method of advertising of which Warren's on the Pyramid is an instance. Not that it is a crime, or even an immorality in the usual sense of the words, but it is a violent offence against good taste and a selfish and inexcusable destruction of other people's enjoyments. No man ought to advertise in the midst of landscapes or scenery in such a way as to destroy or injure their beauty, by introducing totally incongruous and relatively vulgar associations. Too many transactions of the sort have been perpetrated in our own country. The principle on which the thing is done is to seek out the most attractive spot possible, the wildest, the most lovely, and there, in the most staring and brazen manner, to paint up advertisements of quack medicines, rum, or, as the case may be, in letters of monstrous size, in the most obtrusive colours, in such a prominent place, and in such a lasting way, as to destroy the beauty of the scene both thoroughly and permanently. Any man with a beautiful wife or daughter would probably feel disagreeably if he should find branded indelibly across her smooth white forehead or on her snowy shoulder in blue and red letters such a phrase as this: "Try the Jigamaree bitters." Very much like this is the sort of advertising I am speaking of. It is not likely that I shall be charged with squeamishness on this question. I can readily enough see the selfishness and vulgarity of this particular sort of advertising, however. It is outrageously selfish to destroy the pleasure of thousands for the sake of a chance of additional gain, and it is an atrocious piece of vulgarity to flaunt the names of quack nostrums and of the coarse stimulants of sots among the beautiful scenes of nature. The pleasure of such places depends upon their freedom from the associations of everyday concerns and troubles and weaknesses. A lovely nook of forest scenery, or a grand rock, like a beautiful woman, depends for much of its attractiveness upon the attendant sense of freedom from whatever is low, upon a sense of purity and of romance, and it is about as nauseous to find bitters or worm syrup daubed upon the landscape as it would be upon the lady's brow. Since writing this, I observe that 2 legislatures, those of New Hampshire and New York, have passed laws to prevent this dirty misdemeanour. It is greatly to their credit, and it is in good season, for it is matter of wonder that some more colossal vulgarian has not stuck up a sign a mile long on the Palisades. But it is a matter of thankfulness too. At the White Mountains many grand and beautiful views have been spoiled by these nostrum and bedbug-souled fellows. It is worth noticing that the chief haunts of the city of New York, the Central Park, has thus far remained unviolated by the dirty hands of these vulgar advertisers. Without knowing anything about it, I have no doubt whatever that the Commissioners had been approached often by parties desiring the privilege of advertising within its limits. Among the advertising fraternity it would be thought a gigantic opportunity to be able to flaunt the name of some bug poison, fly killer, barrel rectifier, or disguised rum along the walls of the reservoir, upon the delicate stonework of the terrace, or the graceful lines of the Bow Bridge, to nail up a tin sign on every other tree, to stick one up right in front of every seat, to keep a gang of young wretches thrusting pamphlet or handbill into every person's palm that enters the gate, to paint a vulgar sign across every grey rock, to cut quack words in ditchwork in the smooth green turf of the Mall or ball ground. I have no doubt that it is the peremptory decision and clear good taste of the Commissioners alone which have kept this last retreat of nature within our crowded city from being long ago plastered and daubed with placards, handbills, signboards, and paint from side to side and from end to end, over turf, tree, rock, wall, bridge, archway, building, and all. End of chapter 2.